Welcome to the Beckonomics Podcast. I'm your host, Victor Beck, here alongside Hunter Beck, as we break down weekly market movements, macroeconomics, and what investors should be keying into as we look forward in this market environment. As a note, the topics discussed and opinions given are not intended to address the specific needs of any listener. This podcast is for informational purposes only and should not be relied upon for any investment decisions. Clients of Beck Capital Management may maintain positions in the securities discussed in this podcast. Hey Hunter, looking forward to today's podcast. I think we've got a really interesting topic on hand. Going to do a little bit of a recap about our quote unquote magnificent seven stocks and whether or not those are continuing to be magnificent. And then leading into what caused them to kind of be magnificent in the first place, AI technology and advancements in that direction.
Yeah, looking forward to it, Victor. There's been a lot of change in that space over even just the last couple of months. So everyone is thinking of these Magnificent Seven as still magnificent, but as we'll get into, that's not the case for all of them. So,
well, let's get started, Hunter. Why don't you kind of give us a rundown? I mean, we had a huge NVIDIA earnings report last week that we haven't talked about on the podcast yet. So why don't you give us a rundown there and just talk about, what that's meant just for the broad market and, what we saw from that company.
Yeah, sure thing. So for what feels like probably the fourth time in a row, the big story out of Q1 earnings or Q4 earnings that we just got was NVIDIA. Again, they've been the highlight of the earnings season for the past 4 quarters. But once again, NVIDIA crushing it. They beat on just about every metric they have, every metric they report on. There's a solid beat from earnings per share beat expectations by 12.5%, which is very notable because of how elevated those earnings were. They're sky high expectations for this company, really good guidance. And once you add all of those on top of each other to still beat by 12.5% was incredible. Sales beat by 8.5%, which is really great on a company this big because, there are a lot of line items between revenue and earnings, and companies can get to a good earnings number by cutting costs, certain one-time items, but you can't really fudge revenue in the same way for a one-time beat or anything. So 8.5% on sales, really great. And they had a stellar day post-earnings. They set the record for the largest market cap gain in a single day by any company ever at $277 billion. This beat, for reference, Meta had just set a new record only weeks prior, where it gained $196 billion in one day.
Yeah, I think that's pretty remarkable, just considering, we were just talking on our Q4 earnings recap podcast about how impressive that Meta beat was and how pretty insane that market cap gain was. And then, we just saw NVIDIA blow that out of the water. Pretty incredible.
Really no downside to this earnings either. There are no real weak points. They just keep moving forward. And so off of that, we have great news out of NVIDIA. As we've mentioned prior, great news out of Meta. But Victor, you want to kind of give us an update on where some of these other Magnificent Seven companies are landing?
Yeah, absolutely. The Magnificent Seven of 2023 really can't be referred to as the Magnificent Seven of 2024 thus far. We did call out NVIDIA and Meta, which have, been very impressive year to date. You're talking 60% year to date return for NVIDIA, 38% for Meta. I mean, those are by and large, the biggest standouts when it comes to those, Magnificent Seven from last year continuing into 2024. We've also seen pretty impressive returns from Amazon and Microsoft. We talked about on our Q4 earnings recap podcast about their impressive results and how we were pretty impressed by what they were doing. Google is a little bit more mixed. That one's barely down year to date. I mean, they've had some good some good things happening on the AI front, but I've also encountered a few headwinds as well. I know that we're going to talk a little bit about that once we get into our next segment of the podcast. And then you have Apple and Tesla kind of at the bottom, kind of the disappointments of the Mag 7, if you will. So Apple really just because we talked about, like I said, on our last podcast, a little bit of disappointing earnings coming out of China. They are, of course, at the end of the day, a hardware company. So they really rely on those continuing sales. I think my concern is that as these products continue to get better and better, each iteration is not necessarily improving to the extent where consumers are rushing out to buy them, as soon as the next version comes out. So they may, between kind of that dynamic and the China softness, struggle over this next year. And then there's Tesla, which, while operationally they're performing just fine, the whole EV industry is encountering a lot of headwinds right now. And so they've just kind of been sucked up into that. I mean, they had a pretty stellar 2023. So, giving back, they're down 19% year to date. Isn't terribly concerning. And I think they're a company that's kind of, focused on long-term results rather than your short-term price changes. But I'd say NVIDIA, Meta, Amazon, Microsoft, really the standouts so far this year, with Google, Apple, and Tesla, kind of slipping behind a little bit. I think it's really important, going into just kind of this broader AI focus of how much companies, not only in the Magnificent Seven, but across the street, are talking about AI or artificial intelligence in their earnings calls. I looked and noticed that, in 200 of the 500 S&P 500 transcripts, AI or artificial intelligence was mentioned on their latest earnings call. And AI or artificial intelligence was mentioned 1,850 times on those calls. I mean, people are talking about this like crazy. I mean, that's the highest number we've seen over the most recent quarters. And I think this is just a trend that's going to continue to stay. I know that we saw on NVIDIA's call, Jensen Huang, their CEO, really talked about how there's this tipping point in the AI revolution where you're not just seeing tech companies implement AI as far as a software basis goes, but really all industries are utilizing some form of generative AI to improve their businesses. And he noted that those industries, and we're going to kind of dive into some of those a little bit later, but, led by auto, financial services, and healthcare, we're now talking about, multi-billion dollars of both investment and just focus on those AI capabilities. I mean, we're going to continue to talk about that throughout this podcast, but they have pretty big implications for the broad market. So going off of this being such a broad trend in the market, Hunter, do you want to kind of talk about and lead us into what some of the benefits are and maybe some of the potential pitfalls of this technology? I know that we're not quite ready for AI to run the world. So I think it's interesting, kind of some of the things that we've seen recently as far as these developments go.
Yeah, well, I'm going to keep it a little brief on the benefits because I think that's a point where we could sit around and talk for most of the day about, because there are huge benefits in all sorts of industries. And I know we're going to get into that a little bit more later on the specific industry level stuff, because there's a lot of really impressive signs coming out of various industries. It's not just computer science or data science anymore. Kind of like you mentioned, from what Jensen Huang said about that tipping point of now we're seeing all sorts of industries. And so there are a whole lot of unique applications, keep it high level. Really, it's that efficiency driver and the ability to utilize all the data that we have, because there's so much data out there in the world that we just do not have the capability to analyze. So being able to use that more productively is going to be huge for whatever industry you're in. And then I do think we should address a few pitfalls with this whole shift. And it's really nothing wrong with AI as a whole, but it's just, anytime there's a brand new technology, especially one taking the world by storm, such as this one, I feel like people, start to overlook the pitfalls because it's a new early technology. And I think that's kind of one of the pitfalls itself, is that people can find themselves easily trusting AI. And, there have been instances where people are submitting like legal arguments to judges with case law that doesn't exist. That was a real example I heard about the other day of someone typing stuff into ChatGPT and trusting what it came out with because it looks correct, but it doesn't actually exist. So that kind of over-reliance on something that it's kind of a black box system. A lot of these AI models, you put information in and it spits out something, and there's not a whole lot of visibility into how that decision was made. And so it's the kind of blind trust, which I'm sure we will get to someday, but it's going to be a while before we can really trust them that way.
Yeah, I think the interesting thing about these generative AI platforms is that they use a kind of human intellect like approach when it comes to processing that data. But sometimes that means coming out with what's kind of like a human response. Us humans, we're not infallible. And so far, these AI systems have kind of performed similarly that way. I think one that's been in the headlines recently that's really interesting is Google's Bard AI platform, especially when it came to the image generation. And this is where I know that you maybe have a comment on this, but the human interaction piece is really interesting when it comes to these AI platforms, because at the end of the day, you have a human coding these AI softwares. And what came out of the Google Bard image generation platform was frankly pretty hilarious. I'll let our listeners look that one up for themselves. But it shows what can sometimes be the pitfalls is that human factor that plays into, hey, how are these AI programs actually programmed and developed in the first place?
Yeah, exactly. So is the Gemini portion of Bard, that Google software. And even if these models aren't specifically programmed line by line traditionally, it's what training data do you feed them? What does the universe look like to that AI is really going to shape its worldview. It's almost like a person in that sense.
Right. And I think a critical piece of that is you have to have some kind of human screen that comes, on the back end of that as well. You mentioned that law case. These AI platforms still need to be checked and balanced by a human operator, especially someone at a higher level, if you're going to trust what it's going to output. I just read a really interesting article on Bloomberg about how the U.S. military is using AI via their drones to identify both friendly and hostile targets. And of course, we're not ready for, your Terminator Skynet system to come online where, computers strike or choose not to strike at will. These are going through human operators. But the whole point is that you've all of a sudden given people an opportunity to process much more information. I mean, before, when it came to the military, you'd have to have eyes on all of this data feed coming back from drones and a human to decide, hey, is this a hostile target? Is this a friendly target? What are we looking for? And now you've got AI capabilities that can help identify that, where you don't have to have a human operator behind a screen, hoping to catch every single piece of information that crosses in front of them.
Yeah, exactly. It's making people much more efficient in the meantime, and probably for a long period of time. It's all about just making people more efficient rather than doing their jobs for them.
So, Hunter, I know we mentioned talking about the individual sectors, individual industries of where AI is impacting, and these might be some of the things that our listeners have not necessarily heard about. So do you want to kind of segue us into that conversation?
Yeah, certainly. So we've covered, touched on a lot of the obvious ones, the high level front of the news, that your chat GPT, text to text, Google Bard, as well as your Midjourney and Dolly programs that are text to image. There's also a whole lot of applications that are fairly common in call centers now for just customer support, replacing those pretty simplistic chat bots on websites with something a little bit more robust, help you navigate web pages more efficiently, find what you're looking for more quickly. And then one that's been in the media for probably longer than this whole AI craze has been is self-driving cars. That's really taken kind of a back seat to this whole play, which I think is very interesting. On that Tesla note, Elon Musk hasn't come out stating that self-driving is going to happen this year for the first time in about a decade. So it's that little bit of realization that it's going to take a little bit longer than anticipated, but it's still such a big application for this technology that we can't forget about it.
I know something, the autonomous driving, I mentioned this on prior podcasts, something I am personally very excited for as someone who's not a big fan of driving, but, looking forward to that and maybe some time. But I think the systems that are going into place are really, really interesting. The data processing has seriously been augmented by those AI capabilities. I think an industry that I'm really excited about for AI is healthcare. And the whole idea is just improving patient outcomes and reducing costs for those companies. And sometimes this technology is better than a human when it comes to providing those diagnoses. Now you're implementing technology that can look at an X-ray, can look at a scan, and can identify small things that the human eye may not notice. And so you're all of a sudden seeing AI implementation into these screening tools from healthcare companies that actually make the patient outcomes much better. So whereas a doctor, may have a hard time identifying something on a scan, these AI technologies are able to learn via, human teaching and through experience of what to look for on these separate scans. And while the human memory can only retain, so many hundreds or thousands of scans, the AI software is able to keep all of those in a database and learn from them as it goes. So this is really having big implications when it comes to analyzing patient data. And this goes to the pharmaceutical industry as well, analyzing drug impacts, symptoms, side effects, things that would be hard to draw conclusions on if you didn't have these learning systems in place that are really taking advantage of this huge amount of data that can really, really develop some better patient outcomes.
Yeah, and I think something that's really interesting about healthcare specifically is that there's so much data in the healthcare space that previously has been really tough to use, to analyze due to all of the privacy laws in place and everything that goes along with that, very sensitive data. But it's a prime example of a data-rich field that something like AI can get its hands on and drive vast improvements quickly. I know from researching a lot of these healthcare technology companies, it's amazing to see how many companies are currently either launching AI programs or just shipping their products with AI already implemented that can span across systems and across machines to create a very comprehensive picture of a patient's health, which is just incredible.
I completely agree. I think another interesting area is just the business world in general. I know that AI has been implemented in a lot of client relationship management platforms to help better serve clients as a whole. And this is really cross industry. And I think kind of going back to what you were saying as far as the original, or initial uses of AI, eliminating some of those, say call center or kind of chat jobs. I think the broader picture here is that it's not necessarily going to eliminate so many jobs as it is going to elevate many of these jobs. It's going to require far less human, mundane tasks, but going to elevate what they're capable of doing and just create a productivity boom across the economy. Hunter, I know that you mentioned that law case earlier. Do you want to kind of dive into some of the impacts in the law field?
Yeah, I think, there are obviously pros and cons to this because you need to be able to trust the data that's coming out of these AI systems. But realistically, with more training and more time, the law is another great opportunity for AI to get a foothold because it's another one of those industries that has a huge amount of data from current laws to case law, all the way to the other end of the spectrum when you're dealing with evidence and the whole discovery process in general. It's going to prevent all of that drowning someone else in paperwork kind of application. Well, the AI can drown in paperwork and spit out an answer, pretty quickly. So ideally, it's going to make the whole legal system just more efficient, as well as enhance the lives of a lot of these lawyers that currently have to sift through that stuff.
Yeah, I think the data processing piece and the paperwork aspect of this is really interesting. I know that here at Beck Capital, you and I have started using AI to dive into some of these earnings prints more effectively, draw conclusions, bring us to solutions for our clients and for our investments. And the amount of data that you and I are able to process along with the rest of our investment team is so much more than, these legacy financial institutions have been able to do from an analysis perspective. It's really amazing how much information we're able to sift through with the help of these AI technologies to bring certain information to the forefront that can often get hidden or diluted in what is, such a massive amount of information from these companies.
Yeah, it's really been incredible just to see, just over my professional career, to see the difference in that data organization and consolidation.
Definitely. I think another area of the market that's really benefiting from this that, isn't so consumer facing, but is the software and coding implications that AI has. Microsoft recently came out with their Copilot, which is their AI platform for software development, allowing these software coders to not have to write so many lines of mundane script. They're able to implement some very basic functionality in a matter of seconds, which would normally create work that was thousands of lines of code. So just making their businesses much more efficient when it comes to writing a new application or program. No longer are you going to have to slog it out by writing all of this basic functionality. Now you can use something like Microsoft's Copilot, or Apple is developing their own for their coding software that will allow these software developers to very quickly implement basic functionality that doesn't distract them from what the broader picture is for software or for an application.
Yeah, no, that's a lot of the grunt work that's going to be taken away from those coders who can focus, like you said, on the big picture and not worry about typing the mindless stuff, but is required to run the program. And similar to that, I want to touch on cybersecurity real quick. It's become more and more of an issue for people in the modern day. In recent years, it's grown tremendously. Cybercrime has. Cybercrime as a whole is now expected to cost the world over $1 trillion this year, which is spread over direct and indirect costs. But $1 trillion is about 1% of the world's GDP, which is truly incredible. And so cybersecurity companies have been able to leverage AI in a number of ways. It helps with detection of cyber crimes as well as threat analysis on the front end to check your code, to check your systems, and from a number of different angles really just prevent as well as they can all of this cyber threat.
Completely agree. I think the more that our society is protected and insulated from those cybersecurity threats, the better. Bad actors will always be in this world, but the more that we can protect against that, the better. The final industry that I want to touch on before we wrap this up is the transportation logistics industry, I think, really is interesting when it comes to these AI capabilities. Now you're seeing AI implemented to help with traffic management, predicting flight delays, and making ocean shipping safer and more efficient. These are all things that we may not see because they're more behind the scenes, but will really impact our daily lives and just make life that much better and the economy run that much smoother. I think as far as the supply chain management goes, the forecasting of demand and predicting disruptions in supply chains is also going to help. I mean, today we live in that I want it right now kind of a mentality. So the faster that we can get our goods from point A to point B, the better. I think we can all agree with that. And the way that AI is going to help these supply chain and transportation industries is really going to be impactful, over the next few years.
Yeah, I found this really interesting reading about it because you think transportation, you think driverless cars, and that's about it. But there are truly so many other applications in the space beyond that.
Definitely. Well, Hunter, I think we did a great job looking at the broader implications, on the company level for AI and on the industry and sector level. I'd also like to make a note to our listeners, especially if you're someone listening this far into the episode. If you have ideas for future episodes or things that you would like to hear from us about, please send us an email, contact us, reach out, and we'll do our best to get one of your topics of choice on one of our upcoming podcasts. I know we're excited to cover much more in the financial and economic world, but we always appreciate feedback from our subscribers.
Well, thank you, Victor, for joining me on this deep dive into the Magnificent Seven and the current state of artificial intelligence. And thank you, listeners, for joining us on another episode of the Beckonomics Podcast.